and he's now with Jabhat al-Nusra. So, this is, we're 2.5 years into a conflict now that is very bloody, it's very ugly. There are few signs that anything is going to end it anytime soon. And people can get desperate, and they can turn to whatever form of support they feel they have in abundance, and often that is religion.
And where do women fit in this story?
Women have always been there. Women are not absent from the Middle East in general, and the Syrian uprising in particular. I remember walking in protests, and there were women who were smuggling weapons past government checkpoints. There were women who were cooking for the rebel fighters. There were women who simply remained in their homes and did not want to leave them, and that in itself was an act of defiance. They refused to leave their country. I met a woman who was a fighter. So women are there, and then they're not just, I'm just thinking now of, on one of my trips I went to Raqqa city, which is the only one of Syria's 14 provincial capitals to have fallen from the regime's grip. And that happened, I think it was in March of this year, it was earlier this year. And it is now an ISIS stronghold. It is now a stronghold of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. But there are still women and men, but especially women, who are resisting the ISIS in their city. I remember being there a couple of weeks after it fell, and Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, there was no ISIS, it hadn't declared itself yet, but Jabhat al-Nusra was handing out pamphlets about what they considered appropriate female attire. And it was extremely conservative. It wasn't even hijab and abay. It was they wanted the face covered and everything. And I remember handing this around to women, and they just tossed it aside and said, "What is this? Who do they think they are if they think they're going to make us wear something like this?" There is a woman now in Raqqa city, her name is Su'ad Nofal, and she protests every day in front of the headquarters of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham on her own. So, don't discount the participation of Syrian women in their uprising, and Arab women in particular.
And I'm just wondering, though, what are women? How do you access women if you're trying to tell a story and learn about a place and do your reporting? Is it as easy to speak to women as to men?
Well, the fact that I am a woman helps, because many of these towns and villages are rather conservative. So, men often can't get into. They can't. They're gender segregated. In many of these places. So, I can sit with the women, and I can also sit with the men. But some male colleagues can't sit with the women. So, I speak the language, and so I have those advantages. So it's and there are many people who are still in their homes, like I said. So it's not an issue for me.
But have you done much reporting on the civilian activists? You talked about Raqqa, which was the first liberated provincial capital and the only one where it's liberated, meaning the regime is not present. And I met some of the young civilian activists from Raqqa in Turkey, and they were talking about how they had the dual fight against the ISIS and the regime, having lived through great trauma in the course of their activism, in the course of the 2 years of the uprising. And I found them to be sort of a source of hope about Syria and for Syria, because their struggle was one for values, a certain set of values, as opposed to taking up arms and fighting what may be a very long and hard battle to actually win. And I'm just wondering if how much coverage you've done of these civilian activists, and where are they today in Syria?
Yeah, I covered the civilian activists when they were the major force. Unfortunately, it's now the time of the guys with the guns. The civilian activists are still there, however, and with regard to Raqqa in particular, when I was there, it was I remember going into the headquarters of where all the civilian activists were, and they were, very excitedly coming up with logos for their Raqqa Media Center and things like that, and exchanging ideas, and there was an energy about what they were doing. Many of those people now have fled Raqqa city because of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. They feel like they're caught between the regime and the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. When I speak to the few people who I know who are still there and who are still undertake this kind of work, they won't speak to me. If I talk to them over Skype, they won't speak to me voice to voice if there are other people around there. They don't want people to know that they're speaking to a female. One of them spoke to me in the masculine because of the fear of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. They will text me instead. Some of them have invited me to come back, and I think about it. But then others tell me, listen, you can't walk on the street with a man who isn't your relative now because of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. And this is a place where earlier this year I could walk freely. The Islamic State of Iraq and Sham obviously was not, hadn't been formed yet, but Jabhat al-Nusra was there. I saw Jabhat al-Nusra fighters protecting the city's 2 churches. They had people stationed in all sorts of areas. They said that looting was not permitted. They and others, because there was an Islamist coalition. There was order. The bakeries were running, and I want to stress that I saw them protecting the churches. But when the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham came into Raqqa city, they removed the crosses from the churches. I saw it on a snippet of video, and I recognized the church. It was the Armenian church. It was near a public garden, not too far. Short walk from the governor's house. I'd been there before. They removed the crosses from the church, and they put the black flags up. But later that same evening, a group of young Syrian activists from Raqqa city went back under cover of darkness to the church, and they carried the cross, and they chanted, "The Syrian people are one." So even in a city like Raqqa, they're the forces that are still present. So there are guys with guns, but do not discount A, the moderation of Syrians, and B, the desire to not replace one authoritarian system with another.
Okay, one more question before I open it to the audience, and that's just about the perception of the role of the U.S. in Syria. We've gone through ups and downs here, debating for a long time what to do. Then, when chemical weapons were fired, suggesting that we may be ready to intervene militarily, which I think raised expectations on some sides, maybe trepidation in other parts. And now we're sitting back and hoping that negotiations in Geneva will produce some sort of solution in this very complicated situation. I mean, what is the perception of the U.S. that you hear? Is there any understanding of the complications that the U.S., the people of the U.S. would be thinking about in terms of intervention, the complications, and thinking about forms of intervention, or is it just anger?
Well, to start with, the Syrian population was not pro-American. It really was on the same page as the regime, unlike, say, many quarters in Iran where the people are pro-American but the regime is anti-American. So that's the baseline that we're starting with. There was a resentment of the U.S. for a number of reasons, mainly its foreign policy in the Middle East with regard to Israel, the invasion of Iraq, and other things like that. So that's the baseline that you were starting with. Certainly many elements of the Syrian opposition looked and hoped that the U.S. would do something. They wanted something to stop this bloodbath. We've got more than 120,000 people killed in the span of a couple of years. It's a very bad situation for them. There is resentment. There is anger at what is perceived as inaction. There is a growing idea that the U.S. really does want Bashar al-Assad to stay. There is confusion in some parts about what exactly the U.S. wants, but mainly there's this idea that the U.S. wants Bashar al-Assad to stay, that it doesn't care about Syrian lives, Syrian blood, that with the chemical weapons deal in particular, for example, it was like the death of however many people it was, horrendous, horrific, horrible as it was. It was a small percentage, a very small incident and much bigger conflict that has seen well over 100,000 people dead, and yet those were the deaths that counted more than any others. So there's a cynicism as well, and there is just a sense of abandonment, not just from the U.S. but from the world, but particularly from a U.S. that talks about freedom and democracy and the value of human life, and that they think is sitting by and watching as their blood is shed in the streets.
Okay. So just to note for people who may have questions, Rania, I think you were also recently in Jordan and you live in Lebanon, so you can also comment on the situation of the refugees as well. Okay. Please go ahead. Can you identify yourself?
Yeah, my name is Didi Cutler. I've lived in Saudi Arabia and Tunisia. And should I repeat? I'm Didi
Yes.
Cutler. I've lived in Saudi Arabia and Tunisia. And shortly before all the events happened in Syria, I was invited by the Syrian government as a photographer to photograph